Hello, everyone. My name is Devidas. I'm the CEO of the Future Moves Group, and welcome to part 3 of 7 parts of a series on how Singapore handles economic crisis. Today, we're going to talk about the past, the present, and the future of how it has done so. Now, when I talk about the past, I'm really talking about the 1980s and 1990s. If you refer to part 2 in the series and part 1, you would have noted that our past recessions were very sudden, very sharp, very short, and then we returned to a path of very strong growth. So what we did in the past when we made countercyclical interventions as automatic stabilizer, as an automatic stabilization approach, as I covered in the previous video, these tended to be modest. They tended to be very short term. They were also organized in a way to allow the economy to naturally restructure and for policy and planning to take signaling cues from how different sectors were impacted by the economic shock to plan for the next phase of our economic development. So we used economic crisis as a kind of punctuation and signaling indicative mechanism to inform how we should be structuring our economy going forward. And this can be seen through a numerous series of changes in terms of our economic direction, from low skill to more highly skilled manufacturing to basing as a knowledge-based economy, and then into a services-based economy. We also didn't expect our GLCs to play a part in the economic recovery, but to focus on making business decisions. They were permitted to make retrenchment and expected to do so, make organizational changes, change business plans, become more lean, become more competitive. And if they failed to do so, and if they weren't performing, the government was quite prepared politically to shut them down or to radically reorganize their management in order to get better results. The government also adopted wage controls, and this would take place through a mechanism where the National Wage Council, NWC, would make recommendations for wage freezes or wage cuts, which the government would automatically accept and then impose on the economy. And the intention of which was essentially a socio-economic bargain between the government and the workers, that by accepting wage freezes or wage cuts, it would help to lower business costs for businesses, which would help to retain jobs and bring the recovery on board earlier, and therefore trigger a return to growth, which would support not only a restoration of wages, but a return to a path where real wages would increase over time. And countercyclical measures were overwhelming bias in favor of supporting businesses as opposed to supporting households and workers. As I just mentioned, wage controls affected workers who took the sacrifice, where businesses benefited from lower operating costs. And finally, the general approach to countercyclical measures were driven primarily by economic rather than political motives. And this is very important to understand, that at this period of time, Prime Minister Lee and Dr. Goh Keng Swee in the 1980s, who were managing economic crisis, and then in the 1990s, Dr. Goh Chok Tong is our Prime Minister, and Dr. Richard Hu is our Finance Minister, and later on also PM Lee, who was also today PM Lee, who also served as Finance Minister, all focused on trying to achieve real economic results using channels of intervention which were economically sound and justifiable, as opposed to purely focusing on what the political benefits of intervention would be. Now, what we didn't do was that we never tapped on past reserves. We didn't introduce wage support, and there was, as I mentioned, an emphasis on economic motives, and so countercyclical measures weren't populist. The workers were expected to take wage cuts. Retrenchments were accepted as necessary, and none of these were politically popular moves, but the government was prepared to sacrifice political capital in order to be able to um, get the economy back onto a road of recovery quicker and position it for stronger growth over the longer term. Now, something happens in 2009. We get hit by the global financial crisis. The world, it's a very confusing time. It's a very chaotic time. There are fears that we may be entering into a potential global recession on a scale that we've not seen since 1929, 1931. There are four people that play a very important part in how Singapore responded to that particular crisis. The first is Mr. S.R. Nathan, who was our president at that time, and I had the privilege of serving him for 3 years as an honorary aide-de-camp from 2001 to 2003. And he had the moral courage and gumption to take the unprecedented step of approving a draw on past reserves and speaking to the nation and explaining why that was necessary, and that prudent controls were being put in place, and that he had personally validated the justifications given by the government. And that was a tremendous confidence builder and booster for the businesses as well as for households and ordinary workers and people. The second individual was Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who worked very closely with the two other gentlemen featured here, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam, who was Minister of Finance at that time. And essentially was my boss because I was in the Ministry of Finance at that period, and Mr. Heng Swee Keat, who was Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and today who is Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore and expected generally to become the next Prime Minister. Now, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam put together what was called the Resilient Package, which was an unprecedented at that time size of countercyclical intervention, 20.9 billion, of which 4.9 billion was a draw on past reserves. Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister, supported him in that, and Mr. Heng Swee Keat, as Managing Director of the MAS, made sure that the MAS played its role to keep the Singapore dollar strong, but also to monitor the economy and support the Ministry of Finance in terms of economic advice, macroeconomic advice, and giving political support to these measures. Now, not only did we tap the reserves, but we also set a very important precedent, and that's something that people forget today very easily, which was the precedent of returning to past reserves at the soonest possible opportunity the monies that were drawn down. And this was done in 2011. So the reserves were drawn down in 2009, 2010 to early 2011, and they were returned through budget 2011. Of the 4.9 billion that had been authorized by President S.R. Nathan, 4.2 billion had been spent, and that 4.2 billion was returned to the past reserves. And this was at a time when we were still very proximate to the global financial crisis. The future was still very unclear. We had returned to growth in 2010, but there was still a lot of volatility. There was still a lot of uncertainty, and there was certainly no consensus globally as to whether the recovery had consolidated and taken root. But all these gentlemen had the moral courage and the, I think, the ability to act on principle that having drawn on past reserves, the government would return the money at as soon as possible opportunity in order to show to the public as a very strong signal that we wouldn't develop a dependency on past reserves or treat past reserves as a kind of kitty bank to get us out of trouble whenever it occurred. So they deserve a lot of credit for their decisiveness and their leadership. Now let's get to the present. Today, and especially since 2009, essentially we've, for the last decade, been on a permanent stimulus. The fiscal impulse, which is the degree of contribution to GDP by government expenditure over the last decade, has been higher than, as a share of GDP, than any period in the past. And this is because, in part, global economic performance has been low. compared to historical times, and the government has tried to do its best to support the local economy. And it's done so through productive investments in productive infrastructure, particularly, for instance, in transport. The massive expansion of our mass rapid transit lines, massive investments in ensuring that we have water resiliency, the ABC project, massive investments in diversifying our food security system, supply chains, and also massive investments in upgrading the capability and capacity of our defense forces. All of this are, in a sense, a form of stimulus because they are tremendous public expenditures, but they were done with a view to productive infrastructure, which will serve strategically the long-term interests of Singapore. Stimulus and counter-cyclical measures today in 2020 are of a large scale, many times the factor of that historically versus 1980s, 1990s, and many times factor of that in 2009. Secondly, we've tended to develop since 2009 an over-reliance on policy and intervention preceding economic shocks, rather than using economic shocks as a form of signaling and indicative action. And you see that through the Future Economic Council, which was found in 2017, when the economy was having a 2 to 4% growth. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a judgment call, but it does represent a notable change from historical patterns. And of course, today we tap past reserves almost as standard recourse to addressing crisis. And in this occasion, in 2020, we've tapped past reserve to a much greater level than we did in 2009. And in 2009 and in 2020, unlike in the 1980s and 1990s, we introduced wage support. In 2009, it was called JCS. In 2020, it's called JSS, Job Support Scheme in its full title. But what we haven't done, and what we are doing differently from the past, is that we're biasing a lot of that countercyclical support towards households and workers, although we're giving a lot of support to businesses. And we can do this because the total volume of countercyclical measures is so large that we don't have to cut the pie and starve any one of these categories. But it is noticeable that households and workers are receiving a lot more support than they did in the past. And this is reflected in part that wage controls haven't been introduced, unlike 1980s and 1990s. So there's been wage support, but not wage controls. What we've also done is expect GLCs to support policy intervention. And that economic motives seem to now have certain equivalency with political motives. This is in election year. In the next 10 months, we'll have a general election. Ironically, in 2009, we were not in election year, but in 2011, we were in an election year, and the government chose to return the monies to past reserve. So again, speaking to the kind of moral courage and decisiveness and leadership that the four gentlemen I mentioned showed in a year where it was still not certain globally how consolidated the recovery would be, but nevertheless, despite the fact that it was an election year, they returned the money instead of keeping it in reserve as a kind of potential shock absorber to boost the economy if they had to for political purposes. They chose not to. And there's a degree of populism in the way in which we're going about countercyclical measures today, because a lot of these countercyclical measures take the form of job creation through massive expansion of the public service, the creation of 15,000 jobs, to the creation of a lot more support in terms of grants and subsidies. Not all of which necessarily have linkages to recovery-driven actions or catalytic actions for economic restructuring, or at least not clear linkages. So what does the future hold? Well, we may be entering a period of 2 to 3 years or an entire term of government where we have persistent pump priming. Now, as I mentioned, in the past decade, the government has already essentially had a kind of permanent stimulus situation in place, but pump priming here may take that to a whole new level. We may have tripped over into a habit of tapping on past reserves as a standard recourse to dealing with economic crisis, and that has consequences. And we may not make the same decision as we did in 2011, but actually keep the reserves that have been drawn down, expend them, and not return them. And this may not only be because of political reasons, but because of the size of the reserves that have been drawn down, make it much more difficult for the government to essentially draw down from the current account and return to past reserves. It could do so across a period of time and therefore stay consistent with that principle, but it won't be able to repeat its feat that it did in 2011 and return at one go $4.2 billion. It can't do that when we are talking in terms of $90 billion plus. There's also, I think, a potential permanent change, a sense of proportion of how we look at countercyclical measures, given the volume of intervention that the government has committed to this year. And today we seem to expect our GLCs to be intervention channels in a way that we didn't expect them to be in the 1980s and 1990s, nor did we really expect them to be in 2009. And I think going forward, political motives may start to overshadow economic motives. I'm not suggesting that this is a judgment on my part on the good and bad of the moral questions, but it may represent a kind of normalization of politics in Singapore where we start to be somewhat more similar to other democracies where pleasing the people, ensuring that some measures are popularly received, become drivers behind how we do our countercyclical intervention. Now that brings me to the end of part 3. Part 4 will deal with Singapore and economic crisis and will focus on accountability. Again, I hope that you learned from this particular video and had some good takeaways, and I look forward to seeing you on the same channel and the same time for the next episode. Thank you again for watching, and have a great week.